Hi, and welcome to Introduction to Microsoft Word. Before we get started using Microsoft Word today, I do want to show you where you can get the materials that we're going to use in class. If you go to the library's website, that's mybpl.org, one of the many things you can find there is the materials that we have for all of our classes that we teach here through the YouTube channel. If you go to Services and Computers, and then Computer Classes, you'll see here a number of classes and materials available, and you can see two things related to Microsoft Word. Introduction to Microsoft Word Program, that's an outline of what we're going to talk about in class today. It's not a word-for-word guide of everything that I'm going to say, but it is a rough outline and it'll save you some note-taking time. And then, perhaps a little bit more useful, the Introduction to Microsoft Word exercises. This is going to be what we're going to use in the demonstration today, just as a way of practicing a lot of the skills that we're going to go over. This might be useful for you if you're not very good at keyboarding and you want to save yourself the typing time of having to put a bunch of words and text in there to make changes to, just something to practice with. So if you want those, you're welcome to grab them there. If not, by all means, just listen through and play along on your own computer, and that works great too. With that said, I'm going to go over to Microsoft Word now and get started working on this together. Okay, we are now looking at Microsoft Word. For those of you that are interested in this sort of thing, I am using Microsoft Word version 2016 on my computer. That's what we have here at the library and all the staff and public computers, and it's something that you'd be able to use if you were to stop by and use our lab or express stations or our laptops. There is a newer version of this out. If you have a brand new version, you might have Microsoft Word 2019. That's the newest version available. And there's also the cloud version that you would get through Office 365 if you have a subscription to that. So you might see some variations of this. For the most part, though, everything that we do in class today will work just fine on newer or older versions. So if you have 2010, 2013, or even the oldest one that's likely, 2007, just about everything that we would do today will work just fine with that. If you are using the cloud version, you might see slightly fewer options available. If you don't know what I mean by the cloud version, then you probably don't have to worry about this. But what I mean is a version that you would use through a web browser as opposed to a program that is installed on your computer. These tend to be slightly simpler. They don't have quite as many options available, but they can do all the basic stuff. And we're going to be focusing mostly on the basics today. So this should work well for you with any version of Word that you use, and for that matter, just about any word processor that you use. So if you have, for whatever reason, Corel WordPerfect, or if you are using a Macintosh computer and you have a different word processor on there, you'll probably still be just fine. But we are going to be using Word 2016 today. I almost said Word 16. That's a little bit of a shorthand there. And so we're going to be taking a look at all the features and appearance and environment that you can work with this. Now, because this is a big program, we're not going to go through every single button or option that you have available, even though we have a number of Word classes here at the library, and you'll see more and more of these on our YouTube channel as time goes by. We still don't go over every single feature that's available because there's quite a lot. But we're going to go over the bulk of what people use this for. Having spent a number of years in our computer lab, I've seen people working on Word very often, and all the basics that they use and that they ask about are going to be covered in these classes, and most of them will be covered here in the beginning class, because most of what people do is pretty straightforward with these. Now, before we begin, I do want to go over a couple of basic terminology things that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to be giving you instructions using the mouse and referring to images and things that you would see on the screen, and I want to make sure that we're on the same page. When I say left click, or sometimes just the word click, that means to put your mouse over an icon and click it a single time. So I might tell you to left click on the letter B there that I'm highlighting right now, or on the word file in the menu, or any of these things as we go through it, and then I'll be clicking a single time with the left mouse button. A couple of times we will be saying right click. That's to click the right mouse button. That will usually bring up a menu as a list of options that are available. We're going to do that a few times. And if you had cause to double click, that's the left button twice quickly. Typically that's when you're opening up a file or starting the program going in the first place. That's the left one twice quickly. When I talk about the windows, that's the entire rectangle that we have here that this is running in. And we'll have a window typically for each file that is open. Right now I started out with a blank page here in Microsoft Word, and that is one window that is open. When we open up a second file, then that will be another window that's open. So we'll get to that in just a few minutes. And if I talk about an icon, that usually means a small image that represents something else. Very often when we talk about icons, we're talking about the shortcuts on your desktop, so you would double click the icon for Microsoft Word to get it started. Sometimes when people say icon, they're referring to the little images that go with the tasks that you would want to do here in the ribbon that we have across the top, but that's not really the common usage of that term. So I just wanted to mention those before we begin. Now, as I said, I've already opened up Microsoft Word and I'm working with a blank page. If you're creating a new page in Microsoft Word or a new document, you will be asked when you do that if you want to choose any from existing templates. If you're not familiar with what a template is, it's a pre-built structure that you can use to save yourself a little time. You might hear that and say, well, that sounds great. Why would we not want to do that? The reason that I don't start out with the templates is they can be a little bit confusing. They have a lot of stuff built in that you didn't put there, and so the spacing and the layout can get to be a little difficult when you're trying to make adjustments, and all of a sudden things jump to the side one way, or they adjust your text or move things around, and that can be surprising or frustrating for new users. So I normally recommend that we start out with a blank page, and then we go from there and get comfortable working with the tools of Microsoft Word, and once you've got some of the basics put together, then start to experiment with the templates. So that's why we're beginning here with the blank page before we go on to more complicated things. But if you are going to create something new, and I'll show you how to do that a little bit later on, you will have the option of choosing a template if you're so inclined. But we started out with a blank page, and we can see that looking at the screen, there's a few things that I want to point out. You see the little mouse dancing around. That's just my pointer that I'll be using. We'll be using the keyboard more than the mouse for a lot of what we do in Microsoft Word, but I do want to use that as just a demonstration and a teaching tool, as well as for clicking through some of the items. Now, if you have Word 2007 or newer, you have what's called the ribbon across the top here. Those of you that have a much older version would simply have these these menu options that go across the top, starting with the word file. That's why I misspoke there. And when you clicked on those, they would drop down a list of choices. What they changed with the 2007 version, which as you can tell is about 14 years old, is instead of having a list of options appear when you click on the word, it changes the pictures that go across here to do different things. Now, as I'm clicking through this, you might say, boy, that looks like a lot of stuff to learn. That seems pretty intimidating. And you'd be right that it is a lot of things to learn. But the good news is we don't use the vast majority of it. I'm a fairly advanced user of Microsoft Word and other Office programs, and I don't use the vast majority of it. It just doesn't come up in normal everyday use of these products. There's a few things in each of the menus that are worth knowing and that we point out as we go through the classes, but for the most part, just about everything you're going to use is going to be in the Home or the File buttons on the ribbon. I usually tell people in my classes, when you're lost, go home. That's the one that you're going to click on that's going to find the majority of the things that you want. So we're going to start out with that. You might have noticed in my clicking that when I clicked on the word file, that jumped to a different screen. The file button in the ribbon system is the one that's a little bit different than the rest because it takes you to this separate screen where you have a lot of file controls. And I'll get into that in just a moment. But that's typically for things like saving or printing, stuff that we do that's a little bit outside of the basics of working with entering information into our document. So that's how the ribbon works. You click on the category across the top, and then you choose the item that you want from within the ribbon as it appears. Now down here in the screen, we have the bulk of the space. We have this large white area, which is your area to work with. By default, it starts out with what's called portrait mode, so that's the vertical upright thing, where it is 8.5 inches wide and 11 inches tall. This is the normal sheet of paper. This is something that you can change. It's a little bit advanced for today's class, but you can go into the settings and go to, say, a legal document or something wider, change the layout to landscape instead of portrait. You can do all of those basic things. We'll take a quick look at that at the end, but that's not really the focus for today's class. I want to show you where we have the cursor blinking there. The cursor is important to remember because that is where whatever you do will occur. So if I start typing, everything that I type appears where the cursor is. But if I give commands, as we're going to learn to do using the ribbon, that will happen where the cursor is too. So that's an important detail to remember and to learn how to work with as we are creating information here. So I want to talk a little bit about entering in information, just the basic skills of typing things in. So again, we start with the cursor, and as we type, and I'm just going to put in some gibberish here, it fills in information across the page. Now you notice as I do that, those little curly red lines appear underneath. That is the built-in spell check that Microsoft Word provides. If I spell something wrong, it puts a little curly line underneath it. Now you might wonder, how does it know if I spelled something wrong? Well, when you spell something wrong, that means that whatever you typed in does not match a word in the dictionary. So sometimes you might say type in your last name or your street address, and it might put a little curly red line underneath it because it doesn't recognize your name or your address because it's not part of the English dictionary that's built in. That does not mean that you need to change it. Those curly red lines will not appear when you print, so they are not going to be visible on the page. They are a tool for you to help you understand. Now this is of course gibberish, so it's not able to clean that up, but if I were to spell something wrong that was close, I could say, oops, I spelled that wrong, and I want to fix that, and I would do so by right-clicking on the word, and it gives me suggestions for how I meant to spell that. So I choose spell, and it corrects it. Now, if you had sharp eyes there, you might have noticed as I typed spell a word and I put 2 R's in there, it automatically fixed it for me. That's the other thing that the spell check will do. It recognizes some errors that are so common that it fixes them for you right away. Let's see if I can make another one happen here. I type TEH and press space, and it changes it to the, because that's a very common word and one that people typically type wrong. And so it will do some automatic corrections for you like that without you even telling it to. Sometimes, however, you will type something and spell it either so egregiously wrong or it's such a complex word that it doesn't recognize your misspelling and it will have no suggestions. So if I right-click on that, it says no spelling suggestions because it has no idea what I was talking about. In that case, you need to delete it and type in something which I always tell people you don't need to get it right, you just need to get it closer to right. So guess again and hopefully it'll work out better that time. When my child is taking school lessons early on, they talked about what they called brave spelling, where they just encourage them to guess as to how things are spelled and write it out and kind of learn by doing. You can do that with Microsoft Word too. So if you typed something in and you got it wrong, and I wanted to replace it, you could try again, and if you got it closer to right, then they might have some suggestions for you. Now, the way to replace this, the way to make any changes to what you typed, is to use the arrow keys on your keyboard to move the cursor around. You can also take the mouse and simply left-click where you want the cursor to go if you prefer the mouse to the keyboard. And then you can use either the delete or the backspace keys on the keyboard to get rid of what's typed there. Now the backspace will get rid of whatever's to the left of the cursor, whereas the delete gets rid of whatever's to the right of it. So if I backspace across this and type I still spelled hippopotamus wrong, but I got it closer to being right, and so it filled in the correct letter for me and it corrected it. So that's what you're going to see a lot of times as you're spelling along and you're motoring through things. It will just go through and it will either fix things for you automatically, or when you go back and right-click on it, it will offer you possible fixes or suggestions. Now, if I type something in and I decide that I don't want it to tell me that that's spelled wrong again, I can right-click on this and I can either choose Ignore All, which means that it will not tell you again for the rest of this document that it is spelled wrong, or Add to Dictionary, which means that it will add it permanently to the dictionary on this computer that you are sitting at. So it will not work everywhere in the world. If you were to come into our lab and use one of the computers and add things to the dictionary, it wouldn't be there if you came in and you sat down at a different computer the next day. But if this is your home computer and this is, say, the street that you live on or the city that you live in or your own last name or your own first name and it doesn't recognize the spelling and you're tired of having it correct you, you can choose to add it to the dictionary and it will never tell you that that is misspelled again, typed exactly as it is there. You want to make sure that the spelling is correct before you do that, otherwise you might miss a misspelling that you intended to have found, so be cautious about that. Because you can remove things from the dictionary once you've added them, but it is very complicated to do, and so best to be careful before adding things there. Okay, so that is the use of the spell check and how you would use the delete key and the backspace to enter things in. I'd encourage you practicing with this quite a bit if you're new to it or if you're new to typing. Moving the cursor around and deleting things that you've typed in is going to be a key skill that you're going to use over and over again. Now here I would want to go and change Bloomingdale to being a capital word, so I go here, I move the cursor to the right of the letter B, and I backspace, and then I type the letter B. And now I'm ready to go on and type some more. The next thing that I want to go over with you is entering in blank space. I mentioned earlier that everything happens where the cursor is blinking. And this is something that we're going to try over and over again. and focus on moving the cursor around from place to place to fix our mistakes or to enter in new information. A natural question that comes up is, how do I move my cursor? How do I get it, say, down here if I wanted to type something in lower on the page? I can't just click there. It won't go any further down if I click with my mouse, so how do you do it? And the answer is we have special keys on the keyboard that we can use to create blank space and move the cursor around. Some people who are learning on their own or just getting started with word processing will just hold the spacebar down. I strongly recommend against you doing that. That will create very strange spacing in your document, and if you go back to make changes, you're going to have all kinds of problems. I've helped many people over the years that were working on their resumes or other issues, and I was trying to figure out what was going wrong, and then I realized, oh, they've got hundreds of spaces just put into the document to move things where they want them to go, and that can cause a lot of problems with getting things to line up nicely or look the way you want them to look. What you want to use instead is you want to use the Enter key every time you want to move down a line. So you watch as I press Enter, it jumps down a line. Enter again, again, again. Or the Tab key every time you want to move to the right half an inch. So I press Tab, 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 Tab as I'm moving this around. You can also use special commands to center your text if you want to have it exactly in the center of your document, or to align it to the right if you wanted to have it pushed to the right as much as possible. Say if you're putting your signature at the end of a letter and you wanted to have that on the right-hand side of the document, you can do that. Now, if I were to start typing here, you might say, oh, well, that's kind of strange, you moved that over too far. And this brings up an interesting question that comes up a lot in the classes. What if you tab it over too far or you put in too many blank lines? People will ask me all the time, how do I move this text to the left? Or how do I move this up? And this is a confusing point. And if you find this throws you a little bit or bothers you some, I'd encourage you not to get too discouraged, because this is, I believe, the most complicated thing that I teach in this introductory class. People have a hard time with this idea because you can't see what's on the screen. What I want to talk about here is the idea of blank space. We created this blank space that I'm moving the cursor through by pressing the Enter key and then by pressing the Tab key for these blank spaces here. If you want to get rid of these things, if you want to move this text around, the way you do that is you delete the blank space that is in between it. I think this confuses people because there's nothing there to see, and so they don't understand what they're deleting. But if I were to put my cursor on one of these lines and press either the delete or the backspace key, watch what happens as I press backspace here. Hello, how is this? Moved up a line. I'll do it again. The reason for that is you're deleting the blank line that was pushing it down. Everything in Microsoft Word moves when you put something in front of it or above it, it pushes it down. The example I sometimes give in class is if I were to go to the top of this document and hold down the number 2. I know you can't see my hand, but I'm just holding on the keyboard right now. And watch what happens. Okay, whole bunch of number 2s filled in there. And then if I were to ask you, well, okay, what do I do to get the words hello world back to the upper left? You'd probably understand that and say, oh, well, you delete the 2s. And so I would hold down the backspace key and delete all of those 2s. And that is all going away. And now it's back where I want it to go. Most people understand that idea that, oh, there was some junk put in front of it, somebody wasn't paying attention and they were leaning on the keyboard or they typed the wrong thing or whatever it may be, and that filled in some space, we want to get rid of it. However, if instead of the number 2, if I hold down the Enter key, say, whoops, I didn't mean to do that, people are confused about how to get these words back up to the top because they don't see what is pushing it down. There is something there pushing it down, it's just blank space. And so you need to get rid of that the same way. You get rid of that by pressing the backspace key, and that moves it back up. Again, tinker around with this. And by the way, if at any point in this class you want to take a break and practice some of these things, by all means, pause the video and play around with Microsoft Word for a while. So I'd encourage you to try this out, create some blank space, get rid of it, move things side to side using the Tab button in the backspace or up and down with the Enter key in the backspace. But if you have trouble with that, don't let it discourage you too much. Most of the rest of what we'll do, it'll be a little bit more straightforward than that one. So that's working with blank space and entering things in and deleting them using the backspace key and delete key. Okay, let's talk about highlighting and making formatting changes. So, once you've typed in something, if you want to make some changes to not just what you've typed, but its appearance, then we need to use what are called formatting tools. You're going to find all the basic tools for formatting here in the Home tab on the ribbon. And so I'm going to go over a few of these with you here today, some of the most commonly used ones. Now, there are two different ways to do formatting. Some people like to turn the effect on and then type everything they want with that effect and then turn it off. I find that to be a little counterintuitive for a lot of beginners, and so I don't teach my classes that way, but if you're already familiar with that and that's how you work, that's absolutely great. Keep on going in that way. What I'm going to show you is once you've typed something in, if you want to make a change, how you would highlight that text and make the change that you like. So, I have my paragraph here with some gibberish and some typed in words, and I've got my little text right here, and I'm going to show you different things that we can do to this, and then we're going to open up an exercise together and make changes to that. Now, first things first, we need to tell the computer what it is we want to change. So to do that, I told you before that everything happens where the cursor is. This would be the turn the effect on method. So you see where the cursor is blinking right there. It's blinking immediately to the right of the question mark. Again, don't confuse the cursor with the mouse pointer. Very common mistake when we're getting started with word processing. So if I put my mouse pointer up here and then I make the change, that's not going to make the change that I want. So you see the cursor is blinking to the right of the question mark in hello, how is this? If I were to go up here to the formatting changes and click the letter B for bold, now as I type, you see the text comes in thicker and darker or bold. And then if I click it again, now the effect is off. So you can do it that way if you like. As I said, I find that to be a little challenging for beginners. Sometimes they have trouble thinking of everything they would like to do before the text is typed in. It's easier for them to put the information there and then pretty it up by making the formatting changes. So if you prefer to do it that way, what you need to do is once you have something typed in, you would take your mouse, sorry, not your mouse, your cursor, and you would stretch this cursor across it. So instead of just having the cursor somewhere, I need to hold down the Shift key on the keyboard, and then using the arrow, we are stretching the cursor across the text and doing what's called highlighting. Everybody see how that works? And you can move it in either direction to add or remove the highlighting. If you're doing entire lines or paragraphs, you can go up or down and you can do a lot more faster. But if you wanted to do just one word or a sentence, you can use the left or right arrows. You can also, if you're more comfortable with the mouse, click and drag with your mouse across things to highlight, whatever way you prefer. I find for beginners the keyboard is easier to control, so that's what I teach in my classes, but whatever you like to do works best for you. Now, let's go over some of the basics. Up here in the top, in the Home tab, we have the font. Font refers to the text that appears, the individual letters themselves. So I already showed you the bold button. If I click that, turns it on, click it again, turns it off. This is a toggle. I usually compare it to the dome light in your car. You press it once to turn it on, press it again to turn it off. Same with the I, which is for italics. You can see how that makes it slanty looking there. U is for underline. That's fairly self-evident once you do that. Above there, we see a pull-down menu for styles. There are many, many, many different fonts available. As I mouse over them, you see it gives you a preview of it, but it does not actually change it until I click on one of the options. I'm going to do something a little bit obnoxious just so we can see the difference. By the way, we're doing a lot of different effect changes here, and you might say that looks kind of silly. Why would I do all of those things? You probably wouldn't, but you use some of these things here and there to differentiate different parts of your documents, to have certain things stand out. Maybe you'll use the color coding for a schedule or a planner that you have to organize different days. Maybe you'll use underline or bold to separate out headings or different sections of your letter that you've written. They're all very useful. It's just when you use them all at once, it can look like a bit much. Next to the different style, by the way, it still looks slanty because I have the italics on. If I get rid of that, then it goes back to somewhat normal. Next to the style, we have the font size. I don't know why 11 has become the default size. It used to be 12. For a little while, it was 10. You can change it to whatever you like. If you find that this is a bit of a strain for your eyes, then maybe you want to make it 12, maybe even 14. I'm going to make this 12. That's a little bit easier for me. If you like to fit as much as you possibly can into one page, maybe you want to squeeze it down a little bit. Entirely up to you. If you have a title at the top of your page, you might want that to be bigger. You might go as high as some of these other things. If you're printing up a big sign, you might want something very big. So you have a lot of options there. You can also simply type in the number, but most of the time people just use the pull-down arrow. If you're not sure what you want, but you want to tinker with it a little bit, they have the make the font bigger, make it smaller. So you go smaller, 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 bigger, bigger, bigger. So I click on that, and you can work through those. Down here we have the font highlighting. So if you want to put some highlighting to draw attention to things, you can do that. I can also say no color. Whoops, I lost the highlighting across there. So I have to highlight it again. There you go. So I can say no color. And you can also change the color of the actual text. Now you see you have a lot of color options here, and most of the time this will be just fine. If you want to get into more detail, you can go to more colors, and you can choose something more specific. If you're looking for just the right color, you can go to customize, and you can drag your mouse to exactly whatever shade you want it to be. I'm going to say OK. Now you can see that exact shade of purple has appeared there. As we continue looking across all these basic effects that are available to us, if we take a look at the paragraph, the one that I want to show you here real quick is these little pictures of dashed lines. What these represent are different alignments. By default, everything is aligned to the left. That means smooth along the left-hand side, and it just, when it runs out of room on the right, it wraps around back to the left. And it keeps on doing that indefinitely. If you choose the one where they are balanced in the middle but jagged on both sides, that is centered. If you choose the one that is smooth on the right but jagged on the left, that is aligned to the right. We use the left alignment the majority of the time, but the centering one, you do use that periodically for titles or just to pull a quote out of the middle or draw attention to something. I use the right-hand alignment rarely, but occasionally for things like centering, or if I want to put an author's information on the right-hand side. Return addresses sometimes you use for right alignment, so it comes up every now and then. Finally, we have justified. You may have never used this before, but you've certainly seen it before. Most books and magazine articles and newspaper articles work this way. This effect would not really be noticeable with one line, but if you have paragraphs or pages of information that you justify, what it will do is it will stretch the words out and the spacing out a little bit so that it's smooth on both the left and the right-hand side. So it looks like left alignment, but if you look closely, you can see it spaces it out just a little bit to fill things in. People don't typically use this with documents that they type up, but if you're writing anything for professional publication, you might find that useful. One last thing that I want to mention with the font, it's a little bit beyond the scope of today's class, but it's there, so I want to point it out. You have a little button here in the corner of the font that gets you to more options. So if you wanted to see other choices that were available to you, you might click on that and look over, you can have a strike through if you want to make it look like you crossed off what you typed there. Or you can make it superscript so it looks like it's floating above the line, or subscript so it's below it. Sometimes with trademarks or technical writing you might use things like that. You can change things to all caps or to smaller capitalized letters. You can hide the text if you want to. You can change the style of the underline if a basic underline doesn't work for you, if you want to have dashes or something like that underneath it. So there are more options that are available with that. I don't use that too often, but what I do use now and then is for the paragraph. If you go there, you might find that you want to change the spacing. Perhaps you want to go to double spacing or 1.5 spacing. And a lot of people ask about how to get rid of the spacing after a line. And this is a default change that they made a few versions of Word ago, where if you press the Enter key, it automatically puts a little blank space between the previous line and the one that you had. If you're trying to squeeze things in or you just don't like how that looks, you can change the after effect from 8 points font to 0, and that will even it out and it will have everything squeezed more tightly together. So that's something that you could use there. If you want to change your entire document, which is something you would typically do with paragraph changes, instead of dragging across or highlighting with the arrow keys, I can show you a hotkey that you can press. Hotkeys are little shortcuts that you can use. That is the control key that's in the bottom left-hand corner of your keyboard, that's CTRL, and then the letter A, and that highlights the entire document. Once you've highlighted the entire document, if I were to go to paragraph and say change the line spacing to 1.5, that changes the entire document and will change everything as you go. So we'll keep that change for however many pages you go on typing, unless you were to go back and highlight it and change it again. So that can be a useful tool with the formatting changes. One last thing that I want to show you here with the basics of the home menu is if you have something highlighted, we can, in the left-hand side of the home menu here, use copy, cut, and paste. What we're doing with this is we are reproducing something that we have typed in. Now, copying is if you want to duplicate it. So you want to take something and you want to put it somewhere else, but keep it in the original spot as well. Cut is if you want to remove it from where it originally is and then put it to a new place. And paste is what you would do after you have copied or cut it and you move it to where you want it to go. So say I wanted to move this to the top of my document. I would click the Cut button here, and it looks like I deleted it. But if I move my cursor to right there at the top, and then I click Paste, you see it's reappeared right there. Now say I instead want to duplicate something I typed in. If I wanted this Hello World to appear, I could highlight that, and instead of cutting it, if I click Copy, and then I move my cursor down to here, I can paste it in. And in fact, I can paste it in as many times as I want. Some of you might be familiar with copying and pasting using things like Control-C and Control-V, or using the right-click and then choosing Copy or choosing Paste. Those work perfectly fine as well. By all means, if that's how you like to work with it, keep going that way. That is absolutely fine to do. But if you haven't worked with it before, sometimes the buttons are a little bit more intuitive and easier to find. Again, if you're lost and looking for basic functions, go home. That's where you're going to find most of them. A couple other things that I want to mention in the menu system here before we go on to talking about the File button. If you're looking to put any kind of pictures into your document, you would go to the Insert tab, and here you would find where you can put in pictures. You can search for images online. You can put in basic shapes, so if you say you wanted to draw an arrow to something in your document, you can do that. And you can put in charts or other screenshots or things you might want there. If you wanted to put in page numbering, this is where you would do that as well. You can go to page number and you can put in, usually on the bottom of the page, you can put in just a plain number, and now you see the page number has appeared there. And if you go on to a second page, say I press enter a bunch of times, and now I'm on the second page, that appears there as well automatically. So those are some useful things from the insert page. If you go to the layout page, this is where you would change the orientation from portrait to landscape. That's something that we do now and then if we want to have the wider and shorter instead of narrower and taller page. Typically we use landscape more for things like tables or images that we're printing out rather than documents, but you do have that option available to you there. This is also where you would change the margins. By default you have a 1-inch margin around every side and top and bottom of the page, but if you're looking to squeeze a little bit more in there, you can go with narrow margins or you can customize them however works with your printer. Usually most printers can get down to about 1/3 or 1/4 of an inch of space on the margins and still be able to print. Again, it depends on the specific model of printer, but just about everyone you would work with would be able to handle as small as the 1/2-inch margins. And there's also where you would change the size of the page that you're looking to print on. If you're looking to print on envelopes, you can go to mailings and you can print there, as well as labels. That's again a little bit beyond the scope of today's class. I'd encourage you to look at some of our mail merge or printing mailing labels classes that we have, but that is available there. And the review page is where you would go if you want to do a spell check of the entire document. Now personally, I like to use the spelling corrections as they appear. I find it's easier to do that. That way I don't make any mistakes and forget to go back and fix them. So if I see the red line appear, I like to fix that right away. But if you're someone that likes to type the entire thing and then go back, you can fill out your entire document and then you can click the spelling and grammar check and it will go through one by one and ask you what suggested words you may be meant to type in for all of those. Matter of personal preference, however you like to go with it. So just wanted you to be aware of those. So with all of that being said, I now want to take a moment and look at the File option on the page, and then we'll go over some of these exercises together. So if I go to File, here's where we would have some of the basic choices. If we wanted to create a new file, I would click there, and you would see a lot of options available. This is where I mentioned before, we started out with a blank document. Again, most of the time that's what you're going to want to do, but they do have some other options available here. And if none of those worked for you, you can search for online templates and it will try to find things that work better for you. So you could look for different resume options that are available, different timesheet options, whatever it is you're trying to create, cover letters, formal letters to people. They have lots and lots of choices out there, so lots of things you can grab. If you want to open an existing file, so something that you made before and you want to come back to, you would go to Open, and that brings up some choices. Notice that newer versions of Microsoft Word are more integrated with the cloud, and so they encourage you to use things like OneDrive, which is the online storage system from Microsoft. But if you're just trying to get things off of your computer, you could either browse to the location, or you could choose one that you've worked with before. If you want to save your work, you would go here, and again, it would ask you where do you want to save it. Typically, you would want to save to the computer that you're on by clicking Browse, and you would choose the location. You give it a name and the location that you want to. Normally, you would save in the Documents library, and then you click Save, and you can come back and get it later. We have the Print option. When you're printing, this of course requires you to physically have a printer to send things to, but once you choose the printer that you want, you would then be able to print to it. You notice a couple basic options that you have here. How many copies do you want to make of this page? You can choose which pages do you want to print. If you want to list them individually, you would separate them with commas. So if I wanted to print pages 1, 2, and 5 of my document, I would do that. Now there is no page 5 of this document, so it would simply print pages 1 and 2. You can also use dashes, so if I didn't want to print page 1, but I wanted to print pages 2 through 4, I would do 2-4. So say I had a 10-page document and I printed it up, and pages 3, 7, 8, and 9 didn't come out, and I want to try again. I could say print 3, 7-9, and that would print those out for me. If your printer is capable of multi-sided printing, you can choose that there. By default, everything will be collated, which means that your job will print pages 1, 2, 3 if you have 2 copies of it, and then it would print page 1, 2, 3 again, rather than printing page 1 twice and page 2 twice, and so on. That's normally what you want. And this also gives you another chance to just review the options that you put in, that you are printing at letter formation, normal margins, and so on. Now I'm going to go back to the document that we have here, and then I'm going to open up an exercise for us to work on together. Again, I'd encourage you to practice any of these things that we went over. Go to the Home menu, try some of these formatting changes, change the alignment around, change the font size, change the color, the bold, italics, and underline. And if you want an easier way to work with that or to change it, use this exercise that I have available for you to download, and then I am going to show you right now. Okay, finally I'd like to work over this exercise with you. These are all just arbitrary tasks that I put together for us to practice with. If you want to go over this and find where your errors are, I'd encourage you, for this or any other questions you have, to stop by the lab or give us a call here at the library, and we're happy to help you further with this and give you more things to practice. It's just a starter one to work through. So I gave 3 different parts to this for different things that we covered in class today. In part 1, I say I would like you to make the font size for this text much larger, let's say font 18. So I'm going to highlight that. I do that by using Shift and the arrow down key to highlight all of it. And then I'm going to change the font by using this pull down menu to 18. Then in the next part, it says make this sentence bold. I would do that by highlighting simply that sentence and clicking the letter B in the menu there. Feel free to pause and try any of these with me as we go. Then make this sentence italic. I highlight there, and I click on the I for italics. And there we go. And they say after that, underline the whole paragraph. I will again highlight the entire paragraph, and then I click the letter U. Notice how you can have multiple effects on different sections. So if I have my mouse on these words, you see only the U for underline is highlighted. But if I go up to these, I see bold and underline highlighted, and then over here, italics and underline highlighted. Now I will go down to here, and it asks me to center this line. Some of you who have a little experience, you might know that for the alignment, you don't technically have to highlight the entire thing. I still recommend doing it just for good practice and good habits to be made, especially if you have multiple lines to do. But if you're wondering, hey, he doesn't have to do that, you're not wrong. It's just not the best way to go about doing it. So once I've done that, once I've highlighted that entire line, I'm going to change the alignment by going up here to the paragraph, and I click on the centering. Now I'm going to go down to the next one. It says align this to the right. I again highlight it. This time I click the right alignment, and it shoots it over there to the right. And then finally, align me to the left. And so I highlight that. Whoops, I went a little too far, so I push back to the right for the arrow, and that fixes it. Now I click the left alignment button there at the top of the paragraph, and that aligned it back to the left. Now for the next section, I have copies to make, and I want to go over copying and pasting. I say make 5 copies of this sentence. So I'm going to highlight this, and I'm going to click the copy button there. Now I can make these copies wherever I want. So if I put the cursor up here, and I paste a couple of them in, there we go, I can put it there, paste that in, put it right in the middle of this, paste that in. You see, it just sticks it wherever the cursor is. So I can paste this wherever I like, and there it goes. So make sure that you put the cursor where you want things to go when you're copying and pasting. Now I'm going to do the next step where it says, now you should cut this sentence out of the document. So I highlight this sentence, and instead of clicking the copy button, I click cut, and then it says, and paste it 2 lines underneath the sentence. I'm going to go down 2 lines underneath. I put my cursor down there and I pressed enter to create a blank line. And then I click the paste button, and there it goes. You might wonder, why did the paste button make this appear instead of this one? When you copy something, it keeps that in the computer's memory until you copy or cut something else, and then it replaces whatever you copied with the most recent thing. So the most recent thing that you've copied or cut is what will appear when you click paste. So that's copying, cutting, and pasting. Finally, I have part 3 here, and we're doing the spell and grammar check. Now, this is a little glitch depending on which version of Word you're using. For the spelling check, that works by default. It says find the correct spelling of the word rhinoceros. If I right-click on this, I can see the option available, and I click rhinoceros. The next one here shows a version difference from one to the other. Some versions of Word, by default, will have the grammar check appear, and you would see a curly green line appearing underneath here that would tell you that that there's a grammar mistake, that the parentheses are too close. If you see that, then you would right-click on it and it would simply put a space in for you. Other errors do not necessarily come up. In the class I always teach, the grammar check is not to be relied on. The spell check is pretty good. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. Sometimes you get false positives where it tells you that words are spelled wrong when they aren't. The examples I gave earlier, your own names, street addresses, cities in different countries, things that it might not recognize the names of. But you don't often miss words that are misspelled. It's normally going to get things right, except for things like homonyms, where you say use the wrong version of the word to. But the grammar check is not nearly as reliable. Sometimes it's turned on, sometimes it's turned off. So you want to make sure that you keep an eye out for these things yourself. And sometimes when it gives you an error with the grammar check, it doesn't actually tell you how to correct it. It will just tell you things like sentence fragment, consider revising. So you don't want to rely too much on the grammar check, and that's something that I like to point out and I put in here as a reminder to me to make sure to talk about that when we're going through it. There are also some things, again, depending on the settings that you have in Microsoft Word, where you might see style suggestions, where it'll do a curly blue line, and it will suggest, consider revising this, or this is a passive voice, or things like that, where it's not necessarily wrong, but it thinks that you could do better with the writing. That is something that, again, is very subjective, and not necessarily something you would want to follow every time you do it. So, just to be aware of, you have those options available, and I wanted to go over them with you there. So those are some practices that you can do with the formatting, the copy and paste, and the spell check. I'd encourage you to practice this quite a bit. Come up with a task for yourself, whether it's a letter that you wanted to write, make yourself a grocery list or a packing list that you want to keep handy and be able to pull up if you like to travel and you don't want to have to think of remembering all of the various sundries that you need to bring with you every time you go, just to give yourself some experience working with this and working with Microsoft Word. Have it find your mistakes, run into some brick walls, and come back and work with us some more. We'd be happy to answer further questions for you. We do have other Microsoft Word classes available, and you'll be seeing more of them coming up if you want to have further lessons about this. Other than that, I hope you found today's class a little bit helpful, and if you have anything more you would like to learn about, please let me know. My name is Sean. I'm the Computer Services Department Head here. You can reach me anytime here at the library or leave me a message, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible, or come by the lab, and either I or somebody in my staff will be happy to help with any problems that you have. Thank you very much for attending the class, and have a great day.